At the weekly company meeting, the room was filled with chatter, papers shuffling, and the low hum of nervous laughter as the managers gathered around the long glass table. Jared Linton took his usual seat near the end, keeping quiet, waiting for the director to begin. He never liked the spotlight and always let his work speak for him. Callum Briggs, tall, loud, and full of himself, leaned back in his chair across the table. He had a reputation for making jokes at other people's expense, and today he seemed restless, scanning the room for attention. As Jared bent slightly forward to adjust his notebook, Callum smirked and, without warning, shoved Jared's chair with his foot. The back legs lifted off the ground, and in one swift second, Jared crashed to the floor. The sound of the fall echoed, followed by an eruption of laughter. A few tried to hide their smiles behind their hands, but most didn't bother. Even the director paused, eyebrows raised, before awkwardly clearing his throat. Jared's face burned as he scrambled up, brushing off his shirt, pretending the pain in his back didn't matter. What stung most wasn't the fall. It was the way people looked at him, as though he were nothing but the punchline of the day. Callum leaned back again, arms folded, grinning like he'd just won something. Jared caught the smirk, the satisfied gleam in his eyes, and in that moment he didn't speak. He didn't argue. He didn't even defend himself. He only straightened his chair, sat back down, and stayed silent. But inside, something shifted. The laughter faded, the meeting dragged on, but Jared wasn't listening anymore. His thoughts were sharp and cold, his chest heavy with anger. He had trusted this company, trusted his own hard work to earn respect, and now it felt like it had been snatched from him in front of everyone. Callum thought he had humiliated him, thought the fall would break his spirit. But Jared sat there, his eyes fixed on the screen at the front of the room, already making a promise to himself. He would not forget this moment. He would not forgive it. If Callum believed he could kick his chair away and walk off with pride, he was wrong. Jared would make sure the man who made him fall today would lose something far bigger tomorrow. As the meeting ended and people filed out, whispers followed Jared like shadows. He walked out slowly, every step steady. His back hurt, but his resolve was stronger than the pain. Callum might have made him crash in front of everyone, but Jared knew something Callum did. Chairs can be pulled out. Futures can be pulled out too, and Jared was already planning how to do it. Jared had never been the kind of man who needed attention. He liked his work, kept his head down, and made sure everything he touched was done right. His reports were clear, his numbers always balanced, and his projects delivered on time. People relied on him, even if they didn't always say it. For years, he thought that being steady and dependable was enough to earn respect. Callum was different. He walked into every room like it already belonged to him. His loud laugh, his sharp suits, and his endless confidence pulled eyes toward him. What gave him the biggest advantage, though, was his last name. His father sat on the board, and everyone knew it. That connection gave Callum the freedom to take risks, to bend rules, and to play games Jared would never dare. At first, Jared had tried to see the good in him. There were days when Callum seemed friendly, even charming. They had once worked late together on a presentation, and Jared remembered thinking that maybe they could be allies in a tough company. He gave Callum the benefit of the doubt, sharing notes, talking through ideas, even covering for him when he missed deadline. But little by little, Jared began to notice a pattern that cut deeper than simple carelessness. One project stood out in his memory. Jared had spent weeks perfecting a pitch for a new client, gathering data, writing the proposal, and fine-tuning every word. On the day of the meeting, Callum delivered it to the room as if it were his own creation. His voice was smooth, his timing flawless, and when the executives applauded, not a single mention of Jared's name followed. He sat there, silent, feeling invisible, while Callum soaked in praise for work he hadn't done. That wasn't the only time. Rumors began to float around the office about Jared missing deadline, about mistakes in his reports, about him being too slow to keep up with the pace. None of it was true, but the whispers always seemed to trace back to Callum. He was clever about it, never outright accusing, just planting seeds in casual conversations, letting doubt grow where it didn't belong. Upper management never questioned it. They liked Callum's energy, the way he spoke confidently in meetings, the connections he carried with him. Jared's quiet nature worked against him. He didn't fight back, didn't argue, and didn't push himself into the spotlight. To the people in charge, Callum looked like the future, while Jared was just another worker who blended into the background. The hardest part for Jared was remembering the trust he had once placed in Callum. He had thought of him as a teammate, someone who might understand the pressures of the job. Instead, he became the very reason Jared started dreading each day at work. Every small betrayal stacked on top of the last until Jared carried the weight of them like stone. The chair incident had been the most visible, but the truth was that the fall had started long before that day. Every stolen idea, every lie whispered behind his back, every smile Callum gave as if nothing were wrong, it all built up into a mountain of resentment Jared could no longer ignore. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about humiliation in a meeting. It was about years of effort being stolen and dismissed. Callum hadn't just knocked him down once. He had been pushing him down piece by piece for months. And now Jared's patience was gone. Something had shifted. He no longer saw Callum as an arrogant co-worker. He saw him as a target, one he would bring down carefully, no matter how long it took. When Jared walked into his apartment that night, he tried to carry himself as if nothing was wrong. He hung his jacket on the hook, dropped his bag by the door, and went straight to the couch. Elise, who had been waiting for him with dinner, noticed right away that something was off. His shoulders slumped lower than usual, and there was a stiffness in the way he moved. She said nothing at first, giving him space, but when he winced as he sat down, she couldn't stay quiet. She crossed the room, touched his arm, and asked gently, "What happened?" Jared tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing, just a long day. But Elise had been with him long enough to know when he was hiding something. She pulled him toward the light, and when he finally loosened his tie and removed his shirt, her eyes widened. Dark marks were already spreading across his back and side. The fall had left more than just a bruise to his pride. "Jared," she whispered, running her fingers carefully over his skin. "Who did this?" He sighed heavily and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, with a tight voice, he told her about the meeting. About the chair. About the laughter. He didn't need to describe how it felt. The humiliation was clear in the way his voice cracked, in the way his fists clenched against his knees. "It wasn't just the fall," Jared finally admitted. "It's everything. I've given years to that company. Every late night, every piece of work I've done right, it doesn't matter. Some spoiled man who's never earned a thing can treat me like I'm dirt, and they let him. They laugh with him. They make me invisible while he steals everything I've worked for." Elise sat beside him, her hand resting on him. She had seen his quiet strength before, but she had never seen this kind of raw hurt in his eye. He wasn't just angry. He was broken in a way that scared her. Still, she didn't let him sink into it. She squeezed his hand until he looked at her. "Listen to me," she said softly but firmly. "You don't need to shout, and you don't need to fight in front of them. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's when they don't see it coming. When you take everything from them the way they tried to take everything from." Her words hung in the air. At first, Jared said nothing, but she could see the shift in his expression. His jaw tightened, his eyes focused, and the weight of humiliation slowly turned into something else. He wasn't sure yet what to do, but a seed had been planted. It was no longer just about surviving Callum's cruelty. It was about showing him that arrogance has a price, one he wouldn't see until it was too late. Elise kissed his temple and leaned against him, letting silence fill the space again. She knew she had given him something dangerous, but also something he needed, a reason to rise. Jared stayed still, staring ahead, his mind already moving in ways it never had before. What had felt hopeless hours ago now carried a sharper edge. Callum thought he had ended Jared's dignity that day, but in reality, he had just awakened something far stronger. In the weeks that followed, Jared learned to keep his anger hidden behind a calm face. On the surface, nothing about him seemed different. He came to work on time, did his tasks, and spoke little during meetings. Callum treated him the same as always, mocking him in small ways, brushing him off as if he were beneath notice. What Callum never realized was that Jared had stopped reacting because he had started watching. He paid attention to the details most people ignored. Callum arrived at work in expensive suits, carried designer watches, and talked about weekend trips to places far beyond what their salaries could cover. Jared knew the company paid well, but not that well. Each time Callum bragged about a new purchase, Jared tucked it away in his memory. Money was coming from somewhere, and it didn't add up. One evening, Jared stayed late to finish a report. As he walked past the break room, he heard Callum on the phone, speaking in a low but urgent tone. He wasn't careful with his words. Jared caught phrases about covering losses and moving funds before anyone notices. He didn't catch every detail, but it was enough to raise suspicion. Jared kept walking, pretending not to hear, but his mind sharpened with purpose. From that night on, he began gathering more than just observations. He combed through records with a quiet determination, double-checking the numbers Callum had submitted for projects. The inconsistencies weren't huge, but they were there. Figures slightly inflated, costs that didn't match receipts, hours logged that couldn't possibly be true. Alone, they looked like mistakes. Together, they painted a picture of deliberate manipulation. Jared also began listening to his coworkers more carefully. People who once kept to themselves started letting little complaints slip when Callum wasn't around. One said Callum had promised to back him on a proposal, only to later take it over and claim credit. Another mentioned strange gaps in budgets that always seemed to appear after Callum had been involved. No one dared to confront him openly. His father's name carried too much weight, but there was unease spreading quietly among them. Jared didn't press too hard. He nodded, listened, and let them speak as much as they wanted. Each piece of their frustration gave him another fragment of the puzzle. He knew better than to act on emotion. This wasn't about shouting in a meeting or proving he was right. It was about patience. At home, he shared some of what he discovered with Elise. She never pushed, only encouraged him to keep his steps careful. Together, they organized what he gathered, copies of emails, printouts of numbers, and notes on conversations. Slowly, what had started as suspicion began forming into evidence. Callum walked through the office every day with the same smug grin, convinced he was untouchable. Jared let him believe it. He nodded when spoken to, worked quietly at his desk, and gave no sign that anything had changed. Inside, though, he was building something Callum could never laugh away. The cracks were already there. All Jared had to do was widen them until the whole structure came crashing down. Jared knew the only way forward was patience. He could not afford a single mistake. At the office, he behaved as though nothing had changed. He spoke politely to Callum, joined meetings without complaint, and kept his head down when small jabs were thrown his way. To anyone watching, he looked like the same quiet worker who avoided conflict. That mask was important. It kept suspicion away while he worked in the shadows. Every evening, after most people had left, Jared stayed behind. He went through files that others ignored, checking Callum's reports line by line. Numbers that seemed ordinary at first glance revealed patterns the longer he studied them. Certain expenses repeated too neatly, invoices looked duplicated, and amounts shifted slightly from one month to the next without explanation. Jared printed copies and marked them carefully, building a stack of proof that couldn't be brushed aside as accident. Sometimes he caught Callum in the office late at night too. The man thought no one noticed when he slipped into the finance room or left with folders under his arm. Jared began recording dates and times, matching them with the financial discrepancies he uncovered. The picture grew clearer. Callum was moving company money where it didn't belong. At home, Elise became his quiet partner in the effort. She helped him organize the piles of evidence into timelines, making sure nothing overlapped or contradicted. Together they built charts that showed exactly how Callum's lifestyle connected to the missing fund. Elise's sharp, I-caught details Jared overlooked, and her steady calm kept him focused when frustration threatened to overwhelm him. The work stretched on for weeks. Each day felt like a test of endurance. Jared had to face Callum's smug remarks while knowing the truth sat in folders hidden in his apartment. He let Callum smirk, let him laugh, even let him take credit in meetings. None of it mattered anymore. Each grin only fueled Jared's determination. He understood now that revenge was not about anger, it was about control. The more evidence he collected, the more confident he became. He no longer felt powerless. Callum thought he had broken him, but in reality, he had given Jared a reason to sharpen his focus in a way he never had before. Piece by piece, the trap was taking shape. Jared began planning how to reveal it. It couldn't be done too early, or Callum might find a way to cover his tracks. It had to be precise, at a moment when everyone would see the truth at once, leaving no space for denial. Jared pictured that moment often, not out of spite but out of justice. For every stolen idea, every lie, every humiliation, this would be the answer. At work, Callum continued walking with his easy arrogance, certain he was untouchable. He didn't notice Jared's quiet watchfulness, or the way Elise's careful notes lined up each of his mistakes. He didn't realize the ground beneath him was shifting. Every laugh, every smirk, every careless move was only tightening the noose Jared had been building. By the time Callum understood what was happening, it would already be too late. The company had been working for weeks on a major contract, one that could bring in millions if handled correctly. The pressure in the office was high, and every department felt the weight of it. Jared, as always, focused on the details. He double-checked reports, verified numbers, and made sure every part of his role was flawless. Mistakes were not something he allowed. Callum, on the other hand, treated the project like a stage. He spoke loudly in meetings, promised results he hadn't prepared for, and dismissed concerns as if they were beneath him. People followed his lead because of his confidence, but behind that confidence were sloppy choices. One of those choices nearly ruined everything. When a critical error was discovered in the project's numbers, panic rippled through the team. The executives demanded answers, and Callum was quick to point the finger. He raised his voice in the meeting, saying the mistake came from Jared's department. He painted a picture of Jared being careless, suggesting the reports hadn't been checked properly. Every word was a lie, but Callum delivered it with ease, as though he believed it himself. All eyes turned to Jared, waiting for him to argue. He could have pulled out proof right then and there, could have defended himself and shown the truth. But instead, Jared sat back in his chair, his face calm, and simply nodded. "If that's how it looks, then I'll accept responsibility," he said quietly. The room shifted. A few people looked confused, some even uncomfortable, but Callum's grin widened. He leaned back, confident he had once again won. He had pushed Jared down publicly before, and now he believed he had done it again. To Callum, this was proof that Jared would never fight back, never raise his voice, never challenge him. Jared kept his expression steady. Inside, he knew this was exactly what he needed. Callum's arrogance was reaching its peak. By taking the blame silently, Jared wasn't losing. He was feeding Callum's sense of invincibility. And the more untouchable Callum felt, the less careful he became. After the meeting, whispers followed Jared down the hall. Some pitied him, others believed Callum's story, but Jared ignored them all. What they didn't know was that he had already gathered months of evidence. One more lie, one more public humiliation, only added weight to the case he was building. Each insult strengthened the trap waiting to close. Callum, meanwhile, basked in the attention. He bragged to anyone who would listen, proud that he had avoided blame once again. His laughter echoed through the office, loud and careless. He had no idea that his behavior was no longer burying Jared, it was burying himself. Jared went home that evening with Elise, his steps steady. She asked if he was all right, and he nodded. For the first time in a long while, he felt calm. The moment to act was coming closer. Callum believed he had destroyed Jared's reputation, but in truth, he had just walked into the perfect position for his own downfall. The quarterly review was one of the most important meetings of the year. Executives sat lined up at the front, investors filled the back rows, and department heads came prepared with reports that could decide budgets and futures. Jared had spent weeks preparing his part, but this time his folder carried more than numbers. It carried the end of Callum's game. When it was his turn to speak, Jared walked to the front with steady steps. He adjusted the microphone, opened his files, and began presenting the performance of his department. His voice was calm, his explanations clear, and his charts detailed. He laid out growth patterns, expenses, and timelines, making sure every piece was accurate. No one could argue with the strength of the work. Then he shifted. Without raising suspicion, Jared compared his figures with those from Callum's projects. At first, it sounded like routine cross-checking, but the inconsistencies began to stand out. Expenses listed twice. Invoices that didn't match vendor records. Hours logged at impossible times. Jared never mentioned Callum's name, never pointed a finger, but the room grew tense. Everyone understood where the numbers had come from. Jared paused at just the right moment, letting the silence stretch. Then he pulled out the files he had been building for months. He laid them on the table for the executives to see, copies of receipts, records of transfers, notes of late-night access log. Each page tied the irregularities back to the same projects, and each one pointed to the same person. While reviewing data, I noticed patterns that raised concerns, Jared said simply. These records show unauthorized spending and falsified hours. If left unchecked, they could put the company at serious risk. The silence that followed was heavy. Investors leaned forward, executives whispered to each other, and eyes turned toward Callum. For the first time, his usual confident smirk faltered. He shifted in his chair, opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. One of the executives finally spoke. "Mr. Briggs, do you have an explanation for these discrepancies?" Callum tried to laugh, waving his hand as though it were nothing. "There must be some mistake," he said. "Jared's always been, well, meticulous. Maybe too meticulous. He's probably overanalyzing." But his voice cracked slightly, and the room caught it. Jared said nothing more. He didn't need to. The evidence was already in their hands. His silence was stronger than any argument. Executives flipped through the pages, and with every turn, Callum's confidence drained further. His attempts to brush it off grew weaker, as the weight of the documents became impossible to deny. By the time the meeting ended, Callum was no longer smirking. He avoided eye contact, his shoulders tense, his words reduced to half-hearted excuses. Jared gathered his papers calmly and walked back to his seat. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply sat down, hands folded, as the reality sank into the room. The trap had been sprung. Callum thought Jared would always take the fall, but now it was Callum's own numbers dragging him under. For the first time, the power in the room no longer belonged to him. The review meeting left Callum shaken, but he still tried to keep his usual swagger. The next morning, he walked into the office with a forced grin, as if nothing had happened. He joked with a few people, made loud comments, and even gave Jared a smirk across the room. But the energy was different. The whispers were no longer about Jared. They were about him. When executives called him in for questioning, Callum came out of the conference room pale and tense. Later, he tried to joke that Jared had twisted the numbers to make him look bad. Then he changed his story, saying his team had messed up reports and he hadn't noticed. Finally, when that didn't work, he suggested Jared had planted evidence against him. Each excuse sounded weaker than the last. People listened in silence, their faces blank. The days of laughing at Jared's expense were gone. By midweek, an internal audit had begun. Copies of files Jared had provided were compared with financial records, and the truth became impossible to hide. The numbers matched perfectly, and every false expense pointed back to Callum. His charm no longer worked in private meetings. The executives wanted answers, and his father's name no longer carried weight when money was on the line. Corporate fraud wasn't something even family connections could sweep away. The suspension came quickly. Callum was told to clear his desk and step away until the investigation was complete. He left the building without his usual confidence, his face tight with anger. For the first time, the office didn't part for him when he walked by. People watched in silence, and though no one said it out loud, the relief was clear in their eyes. In the days that followed, rumors spread through the company. They weren't about Jared falling in a chair anymore. They were about Callum's lies, his hidden debts, and the way he had nearly dragged the company into disaster. For once, the whispers weren't cruel. They carried a tone of justice. Colleagues who had avoided Jared before now passed his desk and gave a nod or a quiet pat on the back. Some even muttered a soft, "good job" as they walked by. It wasn't loud praise, but it was enough to tell Jared that people knew the truth now. At home, Elise noticed the change in him. His shoulders sat straighter, his voice carried more steadiness. He didn't celebrate or brag, but there was a calm in him she hadn't seen in months. He had endured humiliation in front of the entire company, and now he had taken down the man who caused it. Meanwhile, Callum's downfall grew heavier each day. Investors pulled back trust, executives tightened controls, and his father's influence shrank against the weight of evidence. His reputation, once untouchable, was shattered. The man who had lived off arrogance and power was now left with nothing but silence and suspicion. For Jared, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. Callum had made him fall, but now the ground had shifted beneath Callum instead. His career, his standing, and his future were gone, not by chance but by the truth finally catching up. Jared arrived at the office with the same quiet focus he had always carried, but now there was a difference in the way people saw him. No one looked down on him anymore. His name had become a symbol of honesty and strength, and people respected him for standing firm when it mattered most. He didn't walk with arrogance, nor did he show off. He simply worked, letting his actions speak as they always had. The promotion he never asked for came naturally. Executives noticed that he had not only protected the company from hidden risks, but had done it without seeking attention. He was trusted in ways he had never been before. Colleagues came to him for guidance, not just on projects but on how to handle tough moments. The man once mocked at a meeting had quietly become someone people admired. At home, Elise felt the change in him most deeply. She saw how the shadows that once clung to him had faded. He no longer carried the weight of humiliation on his shoulders. His laughter returned, not loud or forced, but steady and real. The quiet dinners they shared felt warmer, filled with conversations about the future rather than the wounds of the past. She told him one evening, "You're not the man who fell that day. You're the man who stood back up." Jared understood her words well. The pain of that public fall could never be erased. He remembered the sting of laughter, the whispers, the burn of betrayal. But he also knew that pain had sharpened him. It had taught him patience, discipline, and the value of striking only when the time was right. Revenge had not been about embarrassing Callum. It had been about showing the truth. And in revealing that truth, Jared had found something greater than victory. He had found himself again. When he passed through the halls at work now, people greeted him with respect. The smirks were gone, replaced by nods of acknowledgement. He didn't need apologies from those who had laughed before. Their silence and the way they now treated him said enough. He had turned humiliation into strength, and that was a story no one could take from him. Elise often reminded him that life would always test people in unfair ways, but how a person answered those tests defined who they became. Jared had answered with quiet persistence, not anger. He had let the truth carry more weight than his emotions. That choice had reshaped not only his career, but his sense of self. Late one evening, sitting with Elise on their balcony, Jared thought about how far he had come. He knew revenge couldn't wipe away the moment he was kicked down in front of everyone, but it had ensured that no one would ever dare treat him as worthless again. That certainty gave him peace. He didn't need cheers or applause. The victory was personal, and it was enough. Months had passed since that day when everything turned around, yet the memory of it remained sharp in Jared's mind. Walking through the office one late afternoon, he slowed as he reached the familiar conference room. The glass doors stood open, sunlight spilling across the long table where so many important meetings had taken place. For a moment he paused, letting the silence take him back to the day when Callum had humiliated him in front of everyone. He could still picture the shock of the fall, the laughter, the sting of betrayal. But instead of anger, he felt something different now, peace. He stepped closer, resting his hand on the doorframe, and smiled quietly to himself. That room had once been a place of shame, but now it symbolized something entirely new. He whispered under his breath, not for anyone else to hear, but for his own sense of closure. He thought he pulled my chair from under me, but I pulled his entire future out from under him. And the best part, he never even saw it coming. The words carried no bitterness, only truth. Jared continued down the hall, his stride steady and sure. He didn't think of Callum with hatred anymore. What had once been pain had turned into a lesson, a reminder of what it meant to stand tall even after being knocked down. Callum's downfall had been loud and messy, but Jared's victory had been quiet, measured, and complete. That was why it felt so satisfying. Back at his desk, he glanced at the projects lined up ahead of him. His career was no longer about surviving or proving himself to people who doubted him. It was about building something meaningful for himself, for Elise, and for the people who looked up to him. He had grown into a man others trusted, not because he demanded respect, but because he had earned it the hard way. At home that night, Elise noticed his calm expression as he set his briefcase down. They ate dinner together, the air between them light and unburdened. She asked him what had made him smile earlier, and he simply said, closure. She didn't press for more, because she already understood. Elise had seen his journey from the start, from the night he came home bruised and broken to the man who now carried himself with quiet strength. The scars of humiliation hadn't disappeared, but they no longer hurt. They had become part of his story, a story that ended not with defeat, but with triumph. Jared had learned that revenge wasn't about shouting the loudest or striking the hardest. It was about patience, precision, and letting the truth do the work. As he closed his eyes that night, Jared knew he had taken back everything that had been stolen from him. His pride, his confidence, his dignity. He had turned the cruelest moment of his life into the foundation of his strength. And that, to him, was the truest victory of all.